As you're watching this video, what season is it? How can you tell? If you couldn't look at a calendar, how would you know what month it is? Well, for me and many other people around the world, we can answer these questions by looking at what the plants are doing. I bet you're wondering, how can looking at the plants tell me what time of year it is? Well, during this video, you're going to learn all about that, along with how many of our seasons and cultural events are closely tied to the plants that grow at that time of year. Welcome to Nature Studies. My name is Jake. Today we'll be talking about how seasonal plants cue cultural moments. After this video, you'll be able to describe why plants grow at different times throughout the year, explain what the seasonal round is and how it plays a major role in First Nation cultures, list several of the plant species that are important to Ojibwe culture, and summarize what plants are important to our culture here in Wisconsin during each season. Let's get started. So, have you thought of an answer to my earlier questions? How can you tell what season it is? Can you tell what month it is by looking at the plants outside? You'll have good answers for these questions after watching this video. You probably already know that plants need sunlight and water to grow. Different plants also need different amounts of sunlight and water. So it makes sense that throughout the year, as the levels of sunlight and water change, the types of plants that are growing also change. Temperature also plays a major role in what plants are growing. Just by thinking about these three factors, we can already start to see how the plants that are growing are closely related to what season it is. Many of you have probably heard the sayings, April showers bring May flowers, and how corn should be knee-high by the 4th of July. These are small examples of how plants are associated with different times of year. I want you to get out a notebook and be ready to take some notes during this lesson. Now don't worry, these are going to be the easiest notes you've ever taken because I'm going to tell you everything you need to write down. I'm going to give you several questions to think about, along with plenty of information and resources for you to answer them. Let's start by writing down these questions. What are some plants that remind you of each of the seasons? You can write down a few answers now, but save some room to write some things down after the video. Another question for you to write down is, what is the sun, temperature, and water levels like in each of the seasons where you live? Don't worry about writing an answer down now. After the video, you can go to the link I give you for usclimatedata.com and click on your state and city so you can see how the temperature and precipitation change throughout the year where you live. Sunlight varies throughout the year too. In general, we receive more sunlight in the summer and less in the winter. You should look up equinoxes and solstices to find out exactly how the sun moves higher or lower in the sky throughout the year. That should get you started on the right path to answering the questions that I just had you write down. Generally, plants grow well with lots of sunlight, good amounts of water, and average temperature. This means that in Wisconsin, most of the growing happens in the spring, summer, and a little bit into the fall. The winter is the time of year with the least amount of plant growth. In a little bit, I want you to pause this video and go look out a window or go outside for 5 minutes and write down all the plants you see growing right now. You can look up their actual names if you want, or you can just write down a description of them. You can pause the video now and go look outside. Hey, you're back. So, what kind of plants did you see outside? How many different types of plants were you able to find? Keep this page nearby because we'll keep adding to it throughout the lesson. Before I learned about this stuff, I didn't pay much attention to what plants were growing, and I definitely didn't think about how they grew at different times of the year. Now I have a new appreciation for plants because I realize they've been an important part of many cultures for thousands of years. And if we continue to ignore these things, we'll forget about many of the stories, lessons, and uses that were important to our ancestors and other people around the world. We don't rely strictly on the plants growing around us to tell us the time of year or season anymore because we use calendars. But people that live closely to the land, such as First Nation cultures, shaped their yearly cycle around what the plants and animals were doing in each season. For thousands of years, Wisconsin has been home to people of the First Nations, including the Ojibwe people. Traditionally, these cultures lived closely to the land and were able to hunt and gather everything they needed from the environment around them. This includes everything from food and clothing to even medicine and building materials. Literally everything they needed was found in nature. They moved around throughout the year in a large region because they knew when resources would be available in different areas, depending on the seasons. They call this the seasonal round. The main reason they were able to do this is because they had an incredible knowledge of plants. Ojibwe people today are not able to live completely off the land like their ancestors because of the US government and other people that moved into Wisconsin. But they still continue many of the traditional practices of gathering wild plants throughout the seasonal round because it's a key aspect of their culture. Here are a few examples of how each season was devoted to collecting different resources. In the spring, the most notable plant that was harvested was the sugar maple, or as it's called in the Ojibwe language, Ananantig. Ojibwe families would move to the maple grove or sugar bush once the snow melted to start collecting sap from the Ananantig trees to make maple sugar. During the spring, families would also start collecting the plants that began sprouting during this time, like dandelion and other herbs. Later in the spring and in summer months, Ojibwe families would gather in large groups on the shores of lakes, where they would plant gardens. They would also use this time to gather medicinal plants. The Ojibwe, along with many other First Nations people, had practical or medicinal uses for every plant in their environment. Yes, by medicinal, I mean that they use plants as medicine. In fact, most medicines we use today are derived from the chemicals found in plants. The Ojibwe were able to use the plants in their environment for everything they needed, like food, medicine, dye, clothing, or building materials. You can get an idea of just how many different types of plants there are once you start trying to identify them. Usually, any plant that we don't know or recognize, we just call it a weed and think of it as useless. For thousands of years, Ojibwe people have known stories, lessons, and uses for every plant found in their environment. Do you know of any of the uses for the plants you identified? I'll provide you with some links after the lesson so that you can find the multiple uses of the plants you found in your area. Another species that's important to the Ojibwe culture in summer, usually harvested in the end of June, is paper birch. Paper birch, or in Ojibwe, wigwas, is one of the most important species or beings to their culture because of the many gifts and resources it provides. The sap and inner bark of wigwas trees have medicinal uses like relieving stomach cramps and other soothing qualities. The bark itself can be used in many ways. It's waterproof, so it can be used to create canoes or homes. That's actually where the name of their traditional homes or wigwams originates from. The, the bark can be used to create containers for food that are waterproof and prevent the food from going bad. Birch bark can be used for artwork and for ceremonial purposes. And birch bark is extremely flammable, so it can be used to start fires even when it's wet. During the summer season, Ojibwe people also collected berries and other wild edible foods. They would dry a certain amount of these foods to save for the winter months. In the fall, Ojibwe people harvest the most important plant in their culture, wild rice, or as it's known in their language, Manoomin. It's hard for us to understand how truly important wild rice or manoomin is to the Ojibwe people. To get close to understanding its importance, it would be like if you combined all of our culturally important foods into one plant that's also tied to our spirituality and community. Harvesting the manoomin is a major cultural event for the Ojibwe people, who camp out by the rice beds, and the whole family participates in different aspects of the harvest or preservation process. Manoomin is carefully preserved so it can be used year-round for food and ceremonial purposes, and it's still harvested by Ojibwe people today. The fall is also an important time to harvest other plants like the corn, squash, and pumpkins that they planted earlier in the summer in their gardens. Everything that's gathered in the summer and fall, including medicinal plants and foods that aren't needed right away, are dried and preserved for use through the winter. This is very important because nearly all these plants won't be growing in the wintertime. The wintertime is spent focusing on culture, stories, skills, and crafts. I would also like to mention that the Ojibwe people are also in tune with the natural cycles of animals during the yearly round. Throughout the year, Ojibwe people hunt and fish whatever's bountiful, depending on what season it is. Now that we talked about what the seasonal round is, I'd like you to jot down your notes what Ojibwe people are focused on during each of the seasons. Collecting these plants is an incredibly important aspect of keeping Ojibwe culture alive today. They're facing many challenges in the form of climate change. As we learned earlier in the video, plants grow depending on their environmental conditions like temperature, sunlight, and water. As these conditions change due to regional climate changes, it impacts many of the traditional practices of cultures like the Ojibwe. If you want to learn more about how Ojibwe and other First Nation cultures are being impacted by climate change, you can visit the GWOW homepage from the link at the end of this video. Although we don't live as closely to the land as the First Nation cultures did, seasonal plants still play a large role in our lives today here in Wisconsin. Farming's been an important aspect of our state since the first settlers moved here. If you live in a small town, you know exactly what I mean. Even if you live in a large city, there's a good chance that your city began as a farming town. And there's a pretty good chance that some of your ancestors were farmers. Farming and agriculture are still major aspects of our state's culture today. In case you didn't know, agriculture is the practice of farming or cultivating the soil to raise crops or livestock to produce food or other materials. Can you think of any agricultural products or plants that are culturally important to Wisconsin? Cheese is probably the most culturally important agricultural product here in Wisconsin, but there are many plants that are important too. I'll give you a few examples of what plants are important to us in each season. Just like the Ojibwe people, in Wisconsin, our favorite thing to harvest here in the spring is sap from sugar maple trees. We mainly use this sap to make maple syrup, and this makes spring a very important time of year for many Wisconsin families. In the summer, farmers begin planting their fields, and all the trees get their leaves. Wisconsin has some of the best forests in the country, and some of the best meadows and prairies, full of native plants. I challenge you to think of summer without thinking of all the amazing plants that are also growing at that time. One important wild plant is the milkweed. We don't use this plant like the Ojibwe people do, but it's important to us because it's the favorite food of an important pollinator, the monarch butterfly. I mentioned that agriculture is an important part of Wisconsin culture, and fall is harvest time for most of these crops. Most county fairs held all around the state are to celebrate the harvest of our food crops. I'd like you to write down this question and think of a couple answers. What are some of the plants that you can think of that we harvest here in Wisconsin? Feel free to pause the video if you want a little bit more time to answer your question. Have you thought of your answers yet? I bet some of you are thinking of corn, potatoes, and soybeans. Can you think of another crop we harvest? Did any of you think of cranberries? Cranberries are one of the most important crops that we grow here. Our state produces more cranberries than any other state in the US, and more than half of the cranberries grown in the world come from Wisconsin. This crop has a big cultural impact too. Cranfest, or the Warren's Cranberry Festival, is the largest cranberry festival in the world, and it's a major several-day event held every year right here in Wisconsin. Write down this question to think about later. What are some of the crops that your area is known for? It doesn't matter if you live in the city or out in the country. You have definitely eaten food grown right here in Wisconsin. That means that you've experienced firsthand how seasonal plants play a major role in our lives and culture today. Today, we learned how plants grow at different times of the year based on environmental conditions like the sun, temperature, and water. We learned how plants play a major role in the lives of traditional cultures like the Ojibwe people, and how what was going on with the plants influenced what they did throughout the year. We also learned how this is still happening for us today because we rely on the plants our farmers grow, and that plants are still a big part of our culture today. For a final activity, I want you to take the notes you've started working on today and keep adding to them over the next few weeks. First, I want you to check out a few of the links at the end of this video to find out more information about the topics we discussed that you might be interested in. You can look into how the sun moves around throughout the sky each year. You can look into medicinal uses for common plants, or climate impacts on plants in Wisconsin, or even harvest festivals in your area. Secondly, I want you to keep track of what plants you can see growing in your yard or nearby where you live over the next few weeks and months. This way you can see how your natural environment changes throughout the seasons, and you can remember how we use plants to tell us when it's time for important cultural events. Thanks for watching Nature Studies. See you next time.